We are following a developing story in Afghanistan where dozens have been killed in two ISIS bombings. Both happened earlier today in the country's capital city of Kabul. The first explosion happened near the U.S. Embassy, NATO headquarters, and Afghan government buildings. Then, a suicide bomber disguised as a journalist blew himself up as reporters responded to the scene. Several journalists were killed. CBS News correspondent Elizabeth Palmer is following the latest in London for us. So, Liz, these bombings are the latest attacks in a wave of violence to hit Kabul and Afghanistan this year. Why is there a surge in assaults from both ISIS and the Taliban right now?
Well, you put your finger right there on one of the reasons. That is, there are two groups bombing at the moment, both the Taliban, who have been at it for many years, and ISIS, who, having lost a lot of ground in Syria and Iraq, are now trying to make inroads and take territory inside Afghanistan. They are mainly targeting Shia Afghans, especially the Hazara people from the central provinces, and they have a fairly aggressive bombing campaign against them. And then, you know, the Taliban, who have been against democracy, against the U.S. Troops' presence in Afghanistan. They're against the civil government. They're against, in fact, anything that has to do with a representative democracy and government rather than the religious dictatorship that they would like reimposed.
And Liz, I also want to ask you about the reporters killed in the second blast. I didn't know Shah Marai, but I obviously, like a lot of people, followed his work on AFP. What more can you tell us about him? What kind of a journalist was he?
Well, he was persistent. You know, he started out as a driver with AFP way back in 1995. That was in Taliban times. And he picked up a camera a few years later in '98, so 3 years before the U.S. Invaded Afghanistan, and documented the Taliban rule in Afghanistan with great bravery because, as you know, they didn't permit the taking photographs of any living things. So he recorded that era, valuable photographs now. And then when the U.S. troops came, he really felt as if this was going to be the beginning of a new era for his country. And if you read his blogs and look at his photographs, then they're really full of hope. Over the next 17 years, he gradually lost hope and wrote of his mounting despair, but he never quit documenting the great anguish of his country. And of course, he spent much of the last few years covering victims of suicide bombings, the very thing that led to him losing his life this morning. He had a beautiful eye. He had a huge compassion, particularly for the civilians caught up in this terrible war or wars, and he was fearless. He waded in to this morning would have been exactly the way he operated. As soon as they heard there had been another terrible bombing, he headed straight out and was standing in a group of journalists, many of them local journalists, when the second bomber, who incidentally had disguised himself as a journalist, showed up and blew himself up in the crowd. And that's where Shah Marai and at least 7 other journalists died.
It's a good reminder for people watching this, Liz, as our colleague Scott Pelley once put it, that somewhere, someone around the world at any given point in time is risking their lives to bring people information, to bring people the news. I want to ask you a little bit more about ISIS. As they begin to lose ground in Syria, we've heard President Trump and members of his administration say that they are losing ground. Are we expecting more of these foreign fighters to return home, and these militants will then begin ramping up calls for more attacks?
It's very complex. Many of the foreign fighters who were fighting in Syria and Iraq were fighting for the vision of this caliphate that was going to be set up here, a kind of holy land for ISIS and their vision of the way a proper Muslim country, a Sunni Muslim country, should be run. Once they lost that territory, the whole vision of the country dissipated too. And so many of them have literally just gone home or been taken prisoner. Many of them are sitting in prison camps in Turkey. Many of them are sitting in prison camps at home because when they got home, they immediately got picked up by the security services and sent to jail. Now, some of them, the more rootless ones, maybe the more battle-hardened ones who are veterans of other wars, other jihadi wars, will have gone out to Afghanistan. But mostly the Afghan ISIS is a locally recruited group. They're tied into organized crime. They're fighting a turf war with the Taliban. They need a foothold. But I think that the actual links with the original ISIS project are fairly tenuous. Now, security services from around the world are watching to see how that Afghan ISIS movement is morphing and whether it's really going to gain a lot of strength. At the moment, it's a minority player in Afghanistan. The Taliban are still by far the strongest, but they are fighting to get bigger there and have another significant geographic toehold.
And I think that's something that perhaps not everyone is that aware of. I mean, when we talk about what's happening in Afghanistan or even in Syria, there's always this sort of monolithic group of what people call terrorists. But you just pointed out something that I think is important to highlight, this power struggle that is happening between ISIS and the Taliban. Just describe that in a little bit more detail before we go.
Well, all these groups, first of all, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And as you know, there are very conservative Muslims in Afghanistan and that whole region who will see ISIS and indeed the Taliban as fighting for the restoration of a stable religious society. But there are huge links with organized crime, particularly drug running, and both the Taliban and ISIS have links with groups. They will say it's just a way of fundraising, but of course it's more than that. I think that to some extent you can compare them with gangs in that they live for themselves and enriching themselves. It's at the moment you have to see the bombing campaigns as separately focused. So ISIS wants to kill Shia Muslims because that's part of their founding tenets, because they're apostates and need to be wiped out. And the Taliban at the moment are ramping up their traditional spring offensive, so the weather has improved so they can get fighting again to extend their reach. And then they have a special intensity at the moment because the elections are coming up in Afghanistan and they are targeting anything to do with that secular government, with representative democracy, with ties to the West. So, for example, last week there was a bombing outside a voter registration station, a particularly vicious one. 60 people died, including women and children. And then this morning the bombings were near the NATO headquarters. So there you go. That's another anti-Western, anti-representative government target. And I think that we'll probably see more of them between now and the election.
Elizabeth Palmer in London reporting for us and providing some really important context. Thank you, Liz, as always.
My pleasure.